Picture a boy, maybe 10 years old, running up a hill of packed earth on a summer morning around the year 1250. His feet know every step. He's climbed it 1,000 times. And from the top, he can see his whole world laid out beneath him. His most thatched houses stretching to the horizon, cook fires, canoes on the river. Wood smoke from 10,000 hearths, rows of houses further than his eyes can follow. A grand plaza the size of 30 football fields, packed with people, traders shouting prices, drummers warming up for a game, children chasing each other through the crowd. Copper flashing in the sun, shells that traveled 1,000 miles from the sea. This boy lives in the largest city in North America, bigger in this moment than London across the ocean. A city of pyramids and plazas and astronomers right here in what will someday be called Illinois. Now, fast forward 150 years. Same hilltop, same summer light. Kill the ambient city sound entirely for a moment. And there's nobody there. The plaza, empty. The houses, gone. The drums, the smoke, the 10,000 fires. Nothing but wind moving through the grass. An entire city, the biggest this continent had ever built, simply emptied out. No siege, no burned ruins, no mass grave to dig up and explain it. The people just left. And for a long time, nobody could tell you why or where they went. So here's the question that's haunted archaeologists for 200 years. How does a city that big just disappear? For most of the last 2 centuries, people reached for the dramatic answer, because a mystery this big pulls stories toward it like gravity. Some said it was war, that the city tore itself apart, neighbor against neighbor, until nothing was left. Others blamed disease sweeping through streets packed too tight. There were darker whispers, too, that the leaders demanded human sacrifice, and the people finally rose up and walked away in horror. A few even reached for the supernatural, a cursed place, a doomed people, a civilization that offended something and got wiped off the map for it. And when the first European settlers found these giant earthen pyramids, they refused to believe Native Americans had built them at all. They invented a lost race, mysterious mound builders who came and vanished before the tribes arrived. That one wasn't a theory. That was a lie people told to feel better about who they were taking the land from. Here's the thing about all of these. They make a great campfire story. But history is rarely about ghosts and curses. Modern archaeology, a soil core being pulled from wet ground, a researcher's gloved hands, a lab. And thanks to research published in 2024 and 2025, cores pulled straight out of the mud beneath these mounds, we can finally throw most of those old answers in the trash. The truth is stranger, quieter, and honestly, a whole lot more human. Let me show you how they cracked it. First, you have to understand what we're actually talking about, because big Native American town doesn't come close. Around the year 1050, something extraordinary happened on the floodplain across the river from modern St. Louis. Almost overnight, in archaeological terms, within a single generation, a full-blown city rose up out of farm country. Scholars call it the Big Bang. One decade it's scattered villages. The next, it's a planned metropolis with neighborhoods, public squares, and monuments. Monk's Mound, slow tilt up its full height. At its center stood Monk's Mound. 10 stories tall, 100 feet of earth, hauled up one woven basket at a time. An estimated 14 million baskets of dirt carried on human backs. It covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is, to this day, the largest earthwork in the entire Americas. And on top of it sat the home of the ruler, looking down over everything. Below him, a grand plaza. Around that, more than 120 mounds, neighborhoods spreading for miles. At its peak, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people lived here. And when you count the farming towns all around it, maybe 30, 40,000. To put that in plain terms, no city in what's now the United States would be that big again until Philadelphia, right around the time of the American Revolution. 500 years later. These weren't simple people scraping by either. On the western edge of the city, they built a giant circle of red cedar posts. Archaeologists nicknamed it Woodhenge. Line yourself up at the center post on the right morning, and the sun rises directly over Monk's Mound. It's a calendar, an observatory. They were tracking the equinoxes, the solstices, the turning of the year, with the precision of trained astronomers. They traded across half a continent, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, stone from the Appalachians. They played a game called Chunky that drew crowds of thousands. People would bet everything they owned on it. There were feasts here so enormous that archaeologists have found the pits where they dumped the leftovers. Thousands of deer, tens of thousands of pots, all from a single celebration. This was a capital, a holy city, the beating heart of a civilization that stretched across the American Midwest and South. And that is exactly what makes what happened next so hard to swallow. Because it doesn't last. Start around the year 1200, and you can watch the city begin to loosen its grip. Slowly at first, the way a neighborhood changes when you're not paying attention, and then one day you look up and half the houses are dark. One of the strangest clues is a wall. Somewhere around this time, the people of Cahokia build a massive wooden stockade, a defensive palisade nearly 2 miles long, right through the center of their own city. And then they rebuild it. Again and again. 4 times. Now think about what that tells you. You don't wrap your downtown in a 2-mile war wall because everything's going great. Something had them frightened. Whether it was outsiders or their own neighbors turning on each other, we still argue about. But the confidence, the swagger of that early boomtown, it's gone. They're bracing for something. Not burned, just left. Doors open, no people. And then the population just drains away. Not in a night, over decades. By the year 1350, maybe 1400 at the outside, the greatest city in North America is empty. Monk's Mound, that 10-story monument that swallowed the labor of generations, sits abandoned under an open sky. And here's the detail that keeps you up at night. They didn't leave in a panic. There's no layer of ash from a great fire, no battlefield of bones, no sign of a plague pit. It's calm. It's orderly. It's as if 100,000 people looked around one season, packed what they could carry, and walked out the doors of the greatest thing they'd ever built, and never came back. So what do you even do with that? For 200 years, the honest answer was, we had no idea. We just had our dramatic stories, until people started pulling the ground apart, layer by layer, to make it talk. For a long time, the leading theory was the clean one, climate. And there's real evidence for it. We know from tree rings and lake beds that the Midwest got hit repeatedly with brutal swings, punishing floods off the Mississippi. Then, later, a long, grinding drought as the little ice age crept in. And it makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? A city of 40,000 runs on corn. Corn runs on rain. The rain fails, the corn fails. The people starve. The city empties. Case closed. It's tidy. It's satisfying. And in 2024, a study set out to test it and knocked a giant hole straight through the middle of it. Here's the clever part. An archaeologist named Caitlin Rankin, working with Natalie Mueller at Washington University in St. Louis, went looking for the fingerprint a drought would have left behind. The logic is beautiful. If the crops really failed and the fields were abandoned, then wild prairie grass should have come roaring back in to take over that empty farmland. And different plants, corn versus wild prairie grass, leave behind different ratios of carbon in the soil, different isotopes, carbon-12 and carbon-13. It's a chemical signature, locked in the dirt, that you can read like a barcode centuries later. So they pulled the cores, they read the carbon, and here's what stopped them cold. The signature didn't change. There was no invasion of prairie grass, no sign that the fields around Cahokia were dying and going wild. In Mueller's own words, they saw no evidence that the grasses were taking over, which is exactly what you would not expect if these people were being starved out. It turns out the low, wet ground right around the city stayed wet, even while the region as a whole dried out. And these were some of the most sophisticated farmers and engineers on the continent. They stored grain. They ate an incredibly varied diet: fish, waterfowl, deer, bear, nuts, fruit. If a couple of harvests came up short, they had a dozen other things on the table. The drought was real. But the idea that it simply starved this city to death, the ground itself says no. And that's what makes this such a good mystery. Every time you knock down one clean answer, the real question gets sharper. If they weren't starving, if there was no massacre, no plague, no fire, then why would anyone walk away from the greatest city their world had ever known? And the answer archaeologists are circling now is quieter than any curse. It's about belief, about trust. A city like Cahokia isn't just held together by food, it's held together by faith in the whole arrangement. Faith in the rulers on top of that mound. Faith that the ceremonies work, that the games matter, that the center holds. Pile on a couple of generations of floods and droughts, and that 2-mile war wall going up again and again. And maybe what finally broke wasn't the food supply. Maybe it was the belief that this particular way of living together was worth staying for. People don't always need to be driven out. Sometimes they just stop believing the reason to stay. But that still leaves the biggest question of all, the one in the title. If a whole city walked out the door, where did 100,000 people go? For centuries, the assumption was the darkest one, that they simply ended, vanished, died off. A lost civilization, gone from the earth. And this is where the last piece of detective work turns the entire story on its head. Researchers went to Horseshoe Lake, the body of water that sits right in Cahokia's catchment, and they pulled cores from the bottom. This time, they weren't looking for pollen or carbon. They were looking for something a lot more personal. Molecules called fecal stanols, the chemical traces left behind, quite literally, by human waste. It sounds crude, but it's brilliant. Because as long as there are people living around that lake, they leave that signature in the mud, When they leave, the signature drops. It's a population counter, written in the sediment, thousands of years deep. And here's what the mud revealed. Yes, the signal falls off hard when Cahokia empties out, right on schedule, around 1400. But then, it comes back. Within a century, people are living around that lake again, and the numbers climb and climb, all the way up into the 1600s. The land was never abandoned. There was never a lost race. The Native American story here didn't end at Cahokia. It just kept going, in a different shape, under different names. So let's put the whole thing together. Because when you do, that word in the title, vanished, starts to feel like exactly the wrong word. They weren't starved out. The dirt told us that. They weren't wiped out. No massacre, no plague, no fire in the ground. And they were never a lost race that mysteriously disappeared. That was a story other people told, later, for reasons that had nothing to do with the truth. Here's what actually seems to have happened. The floods came, and the droughts came, and the wall went up, and somewhere in there, the faith that held the city together quietly gave out. And so the people did the most human thing in the world. They picked up their families and their traditions and their gods, and they left a place that wasn't working anymore. They scattered out across the rivers of this continent, and they built new lives. And their descendants are not a mystery. They're not gone. They're the Osage, the Quapaw, the Chickasaw, the Natchez. They are living native nations right now, today, with roots that run straight back to that plaza and that mound. We spent 200 years treating Cahokia as a horror story, a city that vanished, a people who disappeared. But nobody vanished. We were just looking for a lost civilization, when the whole time we should have been looking for a family that moved. And a lot of those families never forgot where they came from. And this is the part where I want to hear from you, because a lot of you watching aren't strangers to this story. If your family's from Oklahoma, from the Mississippi Valley, from the Southeast, you may be carrying a piece of Cahokia in your own name and your own history. In an age where half of us have mailed our DNA off in a little tube to find out where we come from, this stops being ancient history and starts being family. The Osage know exactly who they are. So do the Quapaw, the Chickasaw, the Natchez. Those roots were never actually lost. We just weren't looking in the right place. So here's my question for the comments, and I really do read them. Do you buy it? Do you think a city that huge really came apart because people just stopped believing in it and walked away? Or do you think the old answers, the war, the collapse, the climate, still have more truth in them than the new studies let on? And if you've got that personal thread, if this is your family's story, tell us. Tell us the version your grandparents told you. Those are always the best comments on this whole channel, and I mean that. If you made it all the way to the end of a story most people never even heard in school, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So stick around. There's a whole lost world of American history most of us were never taught, and we are just getting started. I'll see you at the next one. If you want to see more about how DNA is rewriting history, subscribe. Every week we find another story that science tells differently.